I want to start off with a quick disclaimer. Specifically, I am in high school. I am not a medical professional, and I have not gone through medical school. So please, if you have a question, ask your doctor. I might be able to answer it somewhat, but you should really talk to a medical professional. First I want to talk about what's in vaccines. What vaccines do. First off, the body responds to germs and stuff through two different types of immunity: the innate and adaptive immune system. The innate system includes phagocytic cells that will go eat up germs and destroy them non-specifically, whereas the adaptive system works a bit differently, and the adaptive system works a bit stronger. So the adaptive system works like a lock and key model. There's specific cells that respond to specific germs. The two main cells here are the T cells and the B cells. T cells will bind to a pathogen specifically, and then they'll activate the corresponding B cell for the pathogen. Once the B cells activate, it'll differentiate into a plasma or a memory cell. The plasma cells, they'll excrete the actual antibodies that will kill the germs, while the memory cells will stick around in case the germ ever returns. This is called the secondary immune response. This is why if you ever get the flu one season, you're probably not going to get it again, because you have that secondary quicker response. So the system works really well, except if a germ or pathogen grows way too fast. So examples of this are like Ebola or polio, things that you could actually die from. The vaccines will activate the system and trigger the memory cells to be created. That way, if you encounter this, you'll have a secondary immune response, which is, again, much faster and will actually protect you. So I want to talk about next what's in vaccines. So there are a couple different types of vaccines that involve different means of attenuating germs. So the first is actual live attenuated vaccines, which contain a weakened form of a germ or pathogen that can't actually cause infection. These are the closest to actual infection, so therefore they're most likely to develop the best response for your immune system. Types of these might include the MMR vaccine, which stands for measles, mumps, and rubella, or the varicella or chickenpox vaccine. Another type are inactivated vaccines, which are actual dead pathogens. These activate the immune system a bit differently, and they may need multiple vaccinations. You also have subunit vaccines, which are just parts of germs, like the pertussis part of the DTaP vaccine, and a couple different types. But the basic thing you need to know here is just that medical professionals and people who make these vaccines they create the safest type of vaccine they can to generate the best response. Moving on, the parts of vaccines include, first off, the weakened or killed germs, as we've already kind of discussed. And the second is preservatives. So preservatives prevent bacterial and fungal growth. And one of the most known ones here is thimerosal. There have been a lot of concerns about thimerosal over the past few years about its safety. But actually, thimerosal is no longer even used in childhood vaccines because of these concerns. And even then, thimerosal wasn't really shown to cause much harm because the body very quickly breaks this down. The biggest chance of a reaction would be an allergy to thimerosal. You also have adjuvants, which help stimulate a stronger immune response, like aluminum salts, which I'll go back to, and stabilizers that help maintain the vaccine potency during its transportation. This might be sugar or gelatin. Some things, like I said, aluminum, sound really scary, but actually you're exposed to trace amounts of this daily. You're actually exposed to between 30 and 50 milligrams of aluminum every day from food, water, and different medicines. Whereas the vaccines that actually do contain aluminum contain between 0.125 and 0.625 milligrams, which is only 1% of your daily allowance. Next, talk about the safety of vaccines. There are a bunch of different stages for the testing of vaccines that make sure the utmost degree of safety is reached. So they have to complete not only exploratory and preclinical stages, but they also have to go through an FDA application for investigation of new drugs, and they have to complete 3 clinical rounds of testing, which range from only tens of volunteers to thousands. After they're actually released to the public, they're monitored continually through the Vaccine Adverse Effect Reporting System, or the VAERS system. And while I'm on that, I want to talk about an important distinction here, which is an adverse effect versus a side effect. Adverse effects may or may not actually be caused by the vaccination, whereas, but they happen afterwards, and side effects are actually medically and scientifically shown to be caused by vaccines already, usually disclosed before vaccination. On that topic, let's look at the actual safety of vaccines. So, according to CDC data from 2012, 451 kids were injured from vaccine-related injuries. So let's look at some similar, or some other activities. First off, injuries playing outdoors, 5,400 kids. Injuries while walking, 34,071 kids. Kids who accidentally drank poison, 69,599 kids. Dogs, 125,328 kids. I guess so much for man's best friend, right? And injuries biking, 223,713 kids. So there's a lot of testing of these products for their safety. And you're actually 83 times more likely to be struck by lightning than you are to have a grave reaction to a vaccination. So I don't know about anybody else, but the chances of vaccines are extremely low, and they are really highly tested for their safety. So moving on, I want to talk about the ethics of vaccines. And mainly there's one ethical objection I've heard come up a lot, especially around like anti-vax forums. And that is that vaccines contain aborted human fetal cells. So to understand where this comes from, you have to understand how vaccines are made, which involve things called cell strains. So cell strains arise from, one, a primary cell culture is taken, and then the cell strain is grown from that. Cell strains actually don't replicate indefinitely, unlike they're not engineered in a lab or mutated to indefinitely replicate. They're a bit more natural. And some examples used in vaccines are the WI38 strains, the MRC5 strain, and different animal strains. The background for this is, in the 1940s, a bunch of birth defects were linked to rubella, and scientists actually discovered a disease called congenital rubella syndrome, which can cause cataracts, deafness, heart disease, and a bunch of other different birth defects that could be potentially fatal to children born from mothers with rubella. So in response to this, in the 1960s, a scientist called Leonard Hayflick derived some of the cells from one of these legally aborted fetuses from a mother who was concerned about this disease, and used it to make the WI38 strain. The WI38 strain he found really grew viruses very well, and he actually used it to make the first modern rubella vaccine. It was licensed in 1979 in the US, and rubella was declared eliminated from the US in 2005. The MRC5 strain similarly arose from like a similar process of fetal cells. And the reasons that the fetal cells were actually used were that viruses grow much better inside actual human cells than animal cells for human vaccines. And fetal cells can replicate for a really long time. Adult cells have a certain amount of division they can reach called the Hayflick limit, whereas fetal cells can replicate for a much longer time. In fact, the same strains that were derived in the 60s are still used today. And they've led to the elimination of a bunch of different viruses are actually removed from the cells, which means none of these cells are present in the actual ending vaccination, which is one of the main arguments against it. So next, moving on to vaccines and autism. So this is what people mainly know about vaccines, and it all stemmed from a paper published by a British gastroenterologist called Andrew Wakefield. He published a paper in The Lancet that described 8 children who had received the MMR vaccine, and had, within a month, been diagnosed with autism spectrum disorder. So Wakefield had noticed that the 8 children had presented with GI inflammation, sorry, and Wakefield postulated from this that the GI inflammation had allowed proteins that were normally not able to exit the gut to travel from the gut to the brain and affect their development. So obviously there are a large amount of flaws with Wakefield's study. And here's just a couple of them. First off, he had no control group, which means there's no actual way to tell if it was a correlation or causal. If you look at the amount of children vaccinated for MMR in Britain at the time, which was 50,000, and take the fact that the MMR vaccine is given between the ages of 1 and 2, when autism spectrum disorder typically presents, you'll find that about 25 kids should present just based off of chance, with exactly what Wakefield described. Second, no blind data was collected, so it was not systematic. Third, the GI symptoms described by Wakefield actually didn't predate the diagnosis with ASD in multiple of the kids he described, which is completely inconsistent with his entire hypothesis. Fourth, the MMR vaccine has not been found to cause GI inflammation by multiple studies. Fifth, and no evidence of the proteins described by Wakefield, the encephalopathic proteins, has ever been found. Following his publication, the UK Medical Council quickly ruled that Wakefield had responded with dishonesty and irresponsibility in his publication. Furthermore, the BBC found that he had no ethical approval from his hospital. He actually paid children at his son's birthday party for blood samples which were used in this study. On top of that, he was serving as a paid consultant for parents who have believed their children have been harmed by vaccines at the time that he published the study. The Lancet paper was since redacted. They actually put out a statement saying it's utterly clear, without any ambiguity at all, that the statements made in the paper were utterly false. And more than 20 studies have not found any link. So finally, do vaccines actually work? So the short answer to this is yes. Vaccines do work very well, and they've eliminated a large number of diseases. It's a bit hard to see, but those small bubbles over there are diseases now versus before modern vaccination. A couple of these diseases include, first off, polio. A small proportion of the people who are infected with polio will develop neurological symptoms such as paralysis. And polio actually also can cause something called post-polio syndrome for kids, which means 10 to 15 years later, they could develop the neurological symptoms such as paralysis. One strain of it was actually eradicated through the polio vaccine in 1999. Moving on to pertussis, which is also known as whooping cough. It's characterized by really extreme coughing fits, and it, in China it's called the 100-day cough because it can last for up to 10 weeks. In the 1990s, 200,000 people were diagnosed with it, and in the 2000s, 30,000 people were diagnosed with whooping cough. 50,000 cases were actually diagnosed, though, in 2012 specifically, which was the most since 1955, indicating a rise in the diagnosis of this, which caused actually 20 deaths. Next is diphtheria. Diphtheria is a bacterium that secretes a toxin that destroys your respiratory system. This toxin will kill the cells in your throat, nose, and cause like a pseudomembrane of dead cells to collect and block your airway. So before the treatment was released for diphtheria, up to half of the people who actually got this disease died from it. But since modern vaccination, only 5 cases have been reported in the past decade. So finally is the most known disease that is vaccinated against, which is measles. Measles, it can have flu-like symptoms, but it can also cause encephalitis. And measles is characterized by its really quick transmission, which means up to 90% of the people who are around someone who has measles can get infected. Since the measles vaccination program began, before it, 3 to 4 million people were diagnosed with measles in the US. But since then, there's been a 97% reduction in the amount of people diagnosed with measles. Unfortunately, there's been a resurgence of this disease. You might have seen in the news cases such as the recent one in New York with the Orthodox Jewish community, who has reported over 700 cases of measles compared to only like 86 3 years ago. We have the capability to almost eliminate this disease, yet it keeps continuing to resurge because people forgo vaccination. So finally, I want to just talk about like what's the point of this, right? So I hope that after like 15 minutes of talking, that you realize that vaccines are really important. It's kind of crazy that people lined up to get the polio vaccine less than 50 years ago, and yet now we have movements that completely denounce them as false science. It's important to remember how awful that these diseases, etc., truly were, so we can recognize this and remember how important these actually are.